So who is Michael? What do you do?
A sort of genius, telling better stories in order to connect more deeply with people, to help people live better. I work with screenwriters and film producers and studios, improving scripts to the point where they can be turned into good movies. So they will not only put butts in seats, but also connect with the audience and inspire them or give them a better sense of what it means to be human. I've been doing that for decades, predictably branched out. So I was working with novelists as well. So that's the film and fiction category. But then about 15 years ago, I got a call from someone who was an internet marketer. And he called me up and said he had seen a video that I had done called The Hero's Two Journeys. And he really liked it. So he said, I'm an internet marketer and I'm getting ready to do a webinar. And I wanted to know if I could fly out from Georgia to LA and meet with you to pick your brain about your story principles and how they would apply to those things. And so I said, that sounds fun. And I thought if he's flying out to LA from Georgia, he's probably willing to pay a certain amount of money. So that sounded appealing. I said, I should probably confess, I don't know what internet marketing is, and I've never heard of a webinar. So I'm not quite sure how I would do this. Now, this was a while back. It just wasn't my world. My world was all movies and then novels. Okay. So he said, this is it. And he flew out and we could meet. And he said, I have an idea for a story for this webinar where there was a situation where I was under investigation for no reason, not guilty of anything, by the IRS. And I had to just dissolve my company and start over. And so he was telling me what was going on. And I said, I don't know anything about webinars, but if this were a movie, what you need to do is you can't just start with the IRS. You've got to tell us who you were at the beginning. So we need to know a picture of your everyday life. And if you're going to do that, you need to create a vivid image of it. So we need to see you at home with your family. And I said, when did they knock on the door? How did you reach them? We got to hear about that. And you've got to create a real moment that's vivid and create more conflict for it and tell us what you did to rebuild your business and so on. So I just kept saying, if this was a movie, if this was a movie. And he did. He put the story in his webinar. He used the story in other webinars. He gave me a quote a few years later that said, I feel like that one story I worked with Michael Hauge on has made me about $10 million over the years. So first thing I realized is, number one, I got to charge more or get a piece of the action. Never did quite match that with him, but it was a great quote. But the other thing it taught me was story to story. So that got me on to another track and other people started contacting me. I do a lot of work with public speakers, a lot of work with internet marketers, with entrepreneurs across the board, with business leaders and so on, all with the idea that you can take Hollywood story principles and use those in telling stories to your followers or your customers or your prospects or to anyone who you're trying to help with your expertise. And you're going to connect with them more deeply if you're telling an emotionally involving story. So that's what I do. I coach people one-on-one with their stories, and I teach storytelling. That's how I see what I'm doing right now. I just spread the word of how powerful stories can be and how you make them better. And that's it. I'm a one-trick pony. It's just how to tell better stories in those two contexts.
I love that. And I see over your shoulder, so you wrote a book on it. So tell me briefly about the book. What's in the book?
Yeah, I actually wrote 3 books. But the one right behind me here that does the biggest thing, that's called Storytelling Made Easy. That's Hollywood principles applied to the business arena. The story principles are the same, but there's a difference in writing a screenplay, which is going to be a 90-minute to 2-hour to now it's getting up to 3-hour story. And if you're in business, you're probably going to top out with your story in about 8 minutes, something like that. So it's shorter and you're not going to go into all of the detail and so on, but the framework would be the same. So where I talk about 6 stages and 5 turning points for a screenplay, in business, you just need to know there are 6 steps that you need to take the hero or the protagonist of the story through, beginning to end in order to persuade your audience or your readers to take the action you want them to take. They're all designed to create an emotional experience. But what movies try to do is entertain. They want to get butts in seats or viewers on cable or whatever it might be. But also, they want to give an experience of this is what it means to be human in the context of usually a fictional, not always, or a sort of fictionalized true story, and entertain people with that. But in business, the primary goal is to persuade someone to take action. So if you're telling us whatever your business is, as you're watching this, your job is to solve a problem for someone. And whatever that problem is that you solve, whatever you have the expertise that you're delivering, in order to help somebody solve their problem, you have to get them to take some kind of action. On the simplest level, if you're a consultant or you've written a book and you want to have a following there, like you've written $1 million book, then what you want to do is tell stories about how you or someone you helped was able to solve the same problem that your audience or your readers or your followers or your prospect or even your own team and your company is facing. So it's a persuasive use of story more than it is when you're writing a screenplay. And it's shorter. So there you can take the same kind of framework and bring it down to where you can take the hero, the main character of that story through those 6 steps, and it will give your audience or reader the emotional experience of actually having that happen to them. So it would, if you're telling a story about a client or a customer you help, then you're giving your audience the emotional experience of actually working with you subconsciously, because that's how stories work. They go into the subconscious and we have that experience rather than just data that might persuade us that maybe your plan is a good one.
That's awesome. So talk me through the 6 steps.
The first,
Do it.
one of the main things you need to understand is that a good story is always about, first of all, a hero, a main character, not necessarily someone who's heroic, but someone usually who becomes heroic in the course of the story. So you got to have the hero. That's just, I use that term for it, but you could say protagonist or whatever. Got to have that character. But then the story is always about that hero pursuing some goal, some desire that they have, and having to face insurmountable or seemingly insurmountable obstacles in doing it. So it's character, and then the character is pursuing a goal, a desire. They face obstacles, both external obstacles, because they've got a serial killer to catch, or they want to win the love of the person of their dreams, or they want to come back, Apollo 13, get back to Earth, or whatever it might be, but also inner conflict, the fears that are holding them back. And then in the course of taking that journey, pursuing that goal, there's going to be some transformation. Oftentimes they will change inwardly and find courage they didn't have and so on. Okay, so if you could think of the 6 steps in a way as like a map, like a treasure map. You go here and here, and at the end is a finish line that person wants to cross. So here are the steps very quickly. The first step is what I call the setup, and that's where you introduce us to the hero living her everyday life before she decides, I want that. So like I was mentioning with Matt Basett, the internet marketing master that was the first one I coached on this story, I said, don't just start by, I was investigated, start by showing us who were you before this happened. That's the setup. And when you introduce the hero, you need to create empathy. So that's when you create a connection between your, I'll just say audience, but it could be the reader of your book, or let's say readers, because this is based on writing your $1 million book. Why do we care about this person? Do we feel sorry for them? Are they a likable person or whatever? Step 2 is the crisis. Now, in that everyday life, some crisis is going to occur that the hero has to react to, has to deal with. So might be a story about how they lost their job. If your book is about how do you find a new job, or If you're telling a story about internet marketing, oftentimes somebody quits their job because they hate it and now they have to find a new way to make money, but they don't know how. The crisis is going to force that character not to take action just yet, or the action they take is figure out, what am I going to do? How do I enter this new world that I've been pushed into? How do I adapt? How am I going to figure out the solution? And then in figuring it out, they finally decide, okay, this is what my specific goal is. This is who's going to help me do that. And then that takes us to step 3 and 4, which sort of intertwine. Step 3 is pursuit, and step 4 is conflict. It means, what are the steps? So let's say you're writing a book, you're an investment advisor or a financial advisor. So you're telling the story about someone and they were about to retire, didn't know what to do with their money. And then something happened or they lost their job and you had to advise them what to do. In the course of telling the story, with the hero being one of your clients, you have to say, these are a couple of things we advise them to do. And then also, these are the obstacles that they had to overcome as they went through that process. And here's how we help them overcome those obstacles. Okay. And then the last two are the easy one, and that is the climax. That's the moment where the hero succeeds, crosses the finish line, achieves the goal of doing the right investments or feeling comfortable about what you'd help them invest or so on. The final step is the aftermath. And the aftermath is, it's not enough to tell the story and say, and then at the end of the story, they had made $100,000. If the goal was they needed to make money to keep their business afloat or something, you always need to say, and as a result of taking that journey, now here's where they are today. Or as a result, they have now been able to overcome. The setup is the before picture, the aftermath is the other one. And one of the things, you may notice this, but that's not very different than the framework you have for $1 million book. Because what you say is, you break it into 3 sort of parts. The first is, this is the problem, right? This is the nature of the problem that your reader is going to be dealing with. Figure out what that is. The next part is the solution. So these are the things that, if you follow the $1 million book process, you're going to help your reader do. And then the last is the future. Okay, so all that is, the nature of the problem is the setup and where they are now. Then whatever the event is, then the next thing is, what's the pursuit and what's the conflict. If you write the book this way, here's what you can look forward to in your life. That's the aftermath, right?
Yeah, as you were sitting here talking, I was thinking about the clients I've worked with going, yeah, like we guide them through a similar journey, but I love applying your language and approach to telling client stories because I think that a lot of people struggle with having these amazing case studies or testimonials or success stories. And then when they're on podcasts or stages or being interviewed, not really knowing how to go about that story. And so it's, oh, I worked with the Joneses and the Joneses said this and that's it. But I love the way you just broke it down because now I could sit here with a cheat sheet and be like, I worked with the Joneses and this is who they are and what their life looked like. They came across this moment where XYZ happened. And at that moment, they leaned in and I helped them try to achieve this goal. Along the way, we found these problems, which resulted in this moment where they were able to achieve it. And here's what that looked like. And then now here's what their life looks like now. That's gold because now there's a set foundation that makes it easy to tell this short narrative that takes people on an emotional arc.
Yeah, that's great. And in your book, the connection expansion, it's the same thing. You're telling someone about how they could expand their network of connections and referrals and so on. But you'd still pick one person that you helped with that process and show how their business was not as big as they wanted to be, or maybe was failing, or maybe they didn't have a business or whatever. And then what are the steps and so on. Now, there's a couple of details I would add to that idea of using that story. One is, the more specific and visible the goal, the more impact the story is going to have. I'll just use you as an example. And one of the clients that you would get from your book, if you're telling a story and you say, the person's business was not doing that well, but I knew that if they could create their connection network, or however you refer to it, their connections, it would be better. So I showed them how to do that. And now they have a lot more connections. Their business has really grown. Now, that works and it's a story. But if you said, this person came to you and they said, my business is going under, I've got to find a way to reach X number of customers. Or you can even say, I know I need to network more. And they said, I figure if I had 100 new connections, things would change. And all you do is add that number, because now I can picture what having 100 connections would look like, at least on paper, or you have that number of people. And if you think about movies, especially Hollywood movies, the ones that are most successful have very clear endpoints that the heroes are going after. They want to win a competition. They want to stop something bad from having alien invasion or a serial killer or whatever it might be. They want to find some buried treasure. It's always a visible thing. So when we know what that goal is, then we can picture it, because you're trying to create a movie in the mind of your reader so that they have the emotional experience of actually achieving that goal. And the more specific the finish line, it's like when you go to a movie, we want to know, who are we rooting for and what do they want? Because we want to know what the finish line is that they're desperate to cross. So if you add that and add detail to the story, now you're going to exponentially increase the emotional involvement and connection you create with your reader.
Yeah, just drop the mic. That's amazing. I think it's so clear. That's gold.
I left you speechless.
Love it. It's really an example of less is more, because I think with you, it's such a clear strategy that I just want our audience to hear that. And then I want them to think about, okay, where could that come into play? It could come into play during your sales process when you're trying to create emotional engagement and share testimonials and case studies. It could show up in your book when you're highlighting examples. It could show up in the whole framework of the book as you're thinking about the narrative the reader's going to go on. It could show up in podcast interviews or on a stage, and even in my own life, I'm starting to go, okay, like when I was on the podcast this morning and they asked for an example, I gave them one and it was good. But now I'm sitting here listening to you going, okay, I could have made it a little more clear who the person was and what they were feeling. I could have then set a better, clearer goal for that person. And then that story would have elevated just a little bit. And that's exciting, because we're not talking about changing the world and like these huge monumental shifts. We're talking about taking the stuff you already have and structuring it in a way that's going to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. The real purpose underlying storytelling is to create connection. When you establish a strong connection, it's the whole framework of creating connections. You want an emotional tie. You want referrals. Referrals are going to come from people who trust you and like you and so on. That emotional connection is what you're after with the story. When you asked me the question, who are you and what you're about, I slipped into a story. I told the story about Matt Basak, and I said, I don't know anything about internet marketing, which is true. And I didn't know what a webinar was at the time and so on. But then the climax was, so I helped him do the story. And the aftermath was he made $10 million off the story. So my aftermath was, I now understand story, or story is story. It came automatically. But the idea was you have a sense of what I do from that, but also you're thinking about trying to figure out, how do I turn a story into a webinar when I don't know what a webinar is?
I love it. And I think it's interesting because I do the same language. And when you started answering, I started going, oh, okay, like this is you telling a story. Interesting. And then as you outline it, I was actually thinking back to your story going, okay, you started here, you anchored visibly. We could picture what that person looked like. We could see the challenge. It was, yeah, I love it. Like stories sell. I've always said that. It's so nice to have someone who has the experience you have, and you've taken that experience and bottled it up for the business community, which is amazing. As we talked about earlier, if you go to your website and they sign up for the newsletter, they're going to get the 6-step sheet.
Yeah. Actually, there's a specific link. There's a specific page they go to, and they will get a chart that lays out those 6 steps I just laid out: setup and crisis and pursuit and conflict and climax and aftermath. So the chart lays it out in very strong left brain form, but it also details what's going on at each one of those stages. So what do you put into each one of those steps to make sure it's working emotionally? And there's one other thing I didn't really mention and I can't get into, but I love the most. And that is when you think about that transformation, the thing that will give your story the most power, the deepest connection with your reader and audience, is if you enter into or you start revealing the inner journey of that character and how they go from living in fear at the beginning, because the start of the story, the person is always going to be stuck. No matter what else they don't know or skill they don't have or whatever, we always get stuck because we're afraid of failing or we're afraid because of some wound we had in the past and so on. That intertwines that inner journey with the 6 steps as well. How does that inner transformation take place? How do they go from being stuck in a state of fear to what I call being in their essence at the end, because they found the courage that allows them to achieve that visible goal? And it's wonderful if your stories can, at least sometimes you can go to that level of fear and courage, because even if you're telling a story about something that the audience or your reader doesn't like, you might be telling a story about someone who their business was floundering, and the person hearing the story might not have a business that's floundering or might not have that experience or might be retired or whatever it is. But if you talk about how that person's fear was holding them back, now it becomes universal, because there's a multitude of external problems you can have and external situations. But when you think about the fear, it always comes down to just a few things. Tony Robbins says there's only 2 real major fears, and that is I'm not good enough and nobody will love me, which I love, because that we're always think we don't want to fall on our face. We're not going to be able to do this. We try and resist things that are out of our comfort zone, and we're afraid people will like us. And as soon as you get to that level of fear, now it doesn't matter if somebody has a business going under. They've all had something they resisted and something they wanted. And when you understand how the 6 steps can develop that, now it really is. Now it goes from gold to platinum as far as I'm concerned.
That's amazing. That's such a good bonus tip. Other than going to the URL, which we'll provide where they can get the
Yeah,
chart, how else do you
yeah.
want people to connect with you? How else can people reach out and,
Yeah.
and get connected?
So if you go to hollywoodstoryselling.com and then /chart, you'll get the free chart. And that will also, when you give your email, then that puts you on to my list, meaning you get my newsletter. So I have newsletters and videos, and I'm on YouTube and I'm on Instagram. My website is actually storymastery.com. And you can also go directly there and sign up for my newsletter. And that has a multitude of things: articles, past newsletters, things about how you can get me to speak to a group or how you work with me one-on-one. But to get the chart, which is free, don't forget, then go to that particular link, because it just makes it very simple to see what the journey is you want to take your hero of your story on.
Love it.
Yeah, it's hollywoodstoryselling.com/chart. That's for the chart. But if you go to YouTube and put in my name, you'll see more of me probably wanting to say.
It's always funny when people are like, how do you get a hold of me? I'm like, just Google my name.
Yeah, I guess I could have said that, but
Yeah, it's always,
I'm too humble and shy to say something like that.
it's funny though. When I'm in a college class, they'll always ask, how do we get a hold of you? I'm like, literally just look me up. I'm on every platform. I'm on every podcast, YouTube, website. You'll get there.